I'm Adam Myers of the Health and the Public Interest Program, a program that emphasizes the non-medical influences on health and healthcare, specifically things like the pharmaceutical marketing and pharmaceutical industry in general, which we're going to hear some about today. Also, things such as healthcare disparities, all the non-medical things that affect health. And we're going to put the URL for our master's program in the chat so you can refer to it if you wish. We invite people to look at it if you're interested in our program. Today's seminar is going on as scheduled against all odds, all kinds of barriers to the seminar getting on track this week. But with the help of Joe Lexchin, we are here, and he faced too, I don't know. But anyway, we're happy to have you here. And the seminar is going to be presented by Joel and moderated by Hallie and of our program. And it's going to be about 40 minutes of seminar presentation, 45 perhaps, followed by a question and answer period, first with students and moderated by Hallie Gill, and then she'll bring in outside people to ask questions after we give students lots of time. Dr. Lexchin, if you want to have people unmute and answer questions or participate before the 40 minutes are up, that's totally up to you. But as you've observed, many of the people just go straight through and then have an interactive period afterwards. So that's all up to you. Whatever you want to do, just let us know and we'll make it happen. So without any further ado, Hallie Gill of the Health and the Public Interest MS program is going to introduce Joel and then moderate the session. Hallie?
Thank you, Dr. Myers. I will go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here today. So to give a brief background on Dr. Lexchin, Dr. Lexchin has been writing and publishing about pharmaceutical policy issues for the past 3 years. He is the author or co-author of over 140 peer-reviewed papers on a wide range of topics in this area, including drug regulation, pharmacosurveillance, drug promotion, research and development, access to medications in developing countries, and physician prescribing behavior. He has been a consultant on these, among other issues, to the Ontario provincial government and various parts of the Canadian federal government, along with the government of New Zealand, to the Australian National Prescribing Service and the World Health Organization. So he has a wide array of health background, and we are pumped to have him here with us today. With that, I will pass it over to you, Dr. Lexchin, to go ahead and get started with your presentation.
Okay, so thanks very much. I'll bring up my slides. If I lapse into medical speak and I use terms that people don't know, feel free to interrupt me and ask. Otherwise, I think it might be best to just leave questions until the end. Okay, so what I'm going to speak about is the difference between what the pharmaceutical industry does in terms of research and development for neglected diseases, and we'll go into what those are in just a minute, and orphan diseases. So these are my disclosures. No drug company money. The royalties pay for maybe a bottle of wine. I'm not getting rich off of them. So we've got 3 learning objectives today: to explore the difference in research and development funding for drugs for neglected diseases versus drugs for orphan or rare diseases, discuss why those differences exist, and look at some alternative approaches for R&D funding for neglected diseases. So this is just a little bit of the difference between what happens with neglected diseases. And neglected diseases are those that occur primarily in low and middle income countries. So um, malaria is an obvious one. TB, although it occurs in developed countries, is primarily a disease of the poor. And then we have other things like schistosomiasis, dengue, fever, a variety of things like that. So there are about 1 billion people annually who have a neglected disease versus 350 million who have a rare disease. A rare disease, and I'll give you some definitions later, but essentially it means something that affects about 1 in 2,000 people. So there is about a threefold difference in the number of people with neglected diseases compared to rare diseases. But the really stark difference is in the amount of money that's spent by the pharmaceutical industry on these two groups of diseases. So for neglected diseases, it's about $500 million, a little bit more. And for rare diseases, it's 35 billion. So when you work that out on an amount per person with the disease, it's 58 cents per person for a neglected disease versus $100 for rare diseases. So almost a 200-fold difference in the amount of money that's being spent by the pharmaceutical industry in these two different areas. And this is just a list of some of the neglected diseases, and you can see how many people are affected by them. So you've got at the top, lymphatic filariasis, 120 million people per year. Whipworm, 600 to almost 800 million people per year. Hookworm, and the list goes on. So a lot of people have these problems. And there are three. The World Health Organization puts them into 3 categories. So type 1 diseases are those that are but ability in people in poor countries is higher, primarily because of social determinants of health, low nutrition status, poor living conditions, things like that. Type 2 diseases have incidence in, again, both rich and poor countries, but they're much more prevalent in the poor countries. HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and then type 3 diseases are almost exclusively found in developing countries. So we've got trypanosomiasis, onchocerciasis, and a whole bunch of others that were on the previous slide. And treatment for all 3 is largely inadequate. So for type 1, there's a lack of incentive to invest in the search for preventive, diagnostic, and curative interventions that are adapted to the resources and the social and economic conditions of low-income countries. So that's things like vaccines some of them need cold chains. So there isn't a lot of research being done into developing vaccines that don't need cold chains. Type 2, the problem is that the strain of things is different in different parts of the world. So HIV/AIDS has strains are different in developed versus developing countries. And type 3 are the worst of the lot because essentially there's no developed country demand, which means that there's no market for these products. So these diseases just get ignored. Here you can see the breakdown of the world pharmaceutical markets. So primarily we're dealing with North America, that's you people, Canada, which is out of that 49.1%, Canada is about 2.2%. So the US primarily, Europe, China, Japan, and then there's the rest of the world. But that's not the distribution of neglected diseases. So here are where you find the neglected diseases. NTD is just neglected tropical diseases. So you can see here, if you compare the two maps, where's the market? And where are the neglected tropical diseases? And there's almost no overlap between these two maps. And the neglected tropical diseases lie outside of the world market. So this figure of 856 billion is somewhat old, but the graphical interpretation of where the market is still accurate. The market is for global diseases, not for neglected diseases. And that's why when you look at how many drugs have been developed for neglected tropical diseases, you see figures like this. So 850 new products approved between 2000 and 2011. And out of those 850, 37 were focused on neglected diseases. And if you look at on your left, we're talking about new chemical entities. So these are drugs that have never been marketed before in any format. 336 were introduced in this time period, and 29 were focused on neglected diseases. So just an illustration of how the pharmaceutical industry ignores these diseases. And for the drugs that have been developed by industry, primarily these are drugs that have a lot of problems associated with them. So they do not, they're not affordable necessarily. They have efficacy problems, they have safety problems, and they are not suitable to developing countries. So even the ones that industry does bring forward have serious problems associated with them. And the reason why these are products for these diseases are not being developed is not because we don't understand the disease, that we lack scientific information about them. That's not the case. So this slide comes from the WHO Commission on Macroeconomics and Health, which was reported sometime back in the 2000s. And you can see there for these 7 different diseases that are listed, the conclusion was that that the feasibility of developing drugs for these diseases was uniformly high. But as I've pointed out, the drugs simply were not being developed. And this is just a little bit more information. So this was a survey that Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, undertook about a little more than 20 years ago. They got in touch with leading drug companies and asked them, were they doing work on a variety of different neglected diseases. So nobody was doing anything about sleeping sickness. One company was doing something about Chagas. One company was doing something about leishmaniasis. Tuberculosis had some activity, but that's because there's some tuberculosis in the US and in Canada. So there's some money to be made from these. The funding for research into neglected diseases does not come from the pharmaceutical industry. So if you look at the top of these bars, that's the orange and the sort of dark green, that's funding coming from the pharmaceutical industry. So very little, in fact, comes from multinational pharmaceutical companies. A little bit comes from small and medium-sized companies, but the majority is public money, and then there is philanthropic money. So we're talking there about Bill and Melinda Gates, and without going into a lot of details, there are significant problems with relying on philanthropic donations for R&D. And if anybody's interested, we can talk about that in the discussion. So this is, there's something called a G Finder report, which just documents on a yearly basis how much money is being spent on neglected diseases, where that money comes from, and it breaks down the amount being spent on research and development for these diseases by disease. I can't remember, I think there are about 10 or 15 diseases that they look at. And you can see here that there was a bit of a bump in the in 2015-16, but it's basically leveled off now. So we're at total a little more than $4 billion per year. But as I said, only a very small fraction of that money is coming from the pharmaceutical industry. And this slide is just an example or an illustrative quote about why we see this disparity. This is from the CEO of Bayer, a large German company, and the one of their products had just been India had issued a compulsory license for it. The generic, which was going to be made by one of the Indian companies, would be 97% lower in price than the brand name product. And when Deckers was asked about this, he said, we did not develop this product for the Indian market, let's be honest. I mean, you know, we developed this product for Western patients who can afford this product, quite honestly. And that's the reality of the situation. Some African countries and countries in some other places have a per capita spend on pharmaceuticals of about 20, 30 US dollars. So you buy one prescription and that's it. You're finished for the rest of the year. So there's no market for these drugs. And so companies, being rational economic actors, don't bother putting money into doing R&D. Okay, so let's switch now to diseases. There are a variety of places that have places that have policies around to stimulate the development of drugs for rare diseases. So, and these are just the definitions that get used for what is or isn't a rare diseases. So in the US, it's fewer than 200,000 people. In the European Union, it's 5 per 10,000. And the numbers for the other countries, Japan, Singapore, Australia, are roughly the same as what's in Europe. In other words, about 1 in 2,000. This is just an illustration of the numbers around rare diseases. So you can see that in the US, not a small market, 30 million people are said to have a rare disease in the US. Now that number of people may be inflated because what's been happening in some diseases, like some forms of cancer, is that there's been what's called salami slicing. In other words, you've got a whole bunch of women who've got breast cancer, but they have different genetic markers for that breast cancer. So each of those counts as a different disease. So the real number of people with rare diseases is maybe lower than that, but still a substantial number. The people who produced the slide said there are 7,000 rare diseases. The FDA has approved 500 orphan drugs since the passage of the Orphan Drug Act, which was in 1983. And the FDA is actually, if you look at their figures, this 1/3 of all new drug approvals being for drugs for orphan diseases is actually on the low end now. It's about 50% of the drugs that are being approved are said to be for rare diseases. So this is just an example of how rare development of rare diseases or drugs for rare diseases is being incentivized. So you've got financial incentives in the US. You have 7 years market exclusivity from approval. In other words, nobody can market a similar drug for 7 years, 10 years in the EU, 10 years in Japan, and some more ways of reducing R&D costs, depending on which country we're talking about. So there is a tax credit in the US for R&D. There are grants for phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. If you want to get a drug approved by the FDA, you have to pay user fees to the FDA. These are being waived. If you're a small company and you're trying to get a drug approved. And similarly, in the European Union and in Japan, there are a number of financial incentives because the governments in those countries say that it's important to develop drugs for these diseases. And that's not unfair. I mean, if you've got a rare disease, you want something to be able to help you with it. So encouraging companies to develop drugs for these things is reasonable to do. But it also doesn't cost as much money to develop a drug for a rare or orphan disease as it does for a non-orphan disease. So these are figures from about a decade ago, just under $500 million to develop a non-orphan disease versus half of that, roughly, to develop a drug for an orphan disease. And a lot of that is due to the fact that clinical trials for orphan diseases enroll a lot fewer people simply because there aren't nearly as many people who have the disease. Smaller clinical trials means lower costs. However, lower costs don't translate into lower sales. So this is from 2015, and the dark green are orphan drugs. So these are the 10 best-selling drugs in the US in 2015, and out of those, 7 of those were drugs that were approved for 1 or more orphan diseases. So you're going to make a lot of money selling drugs for orphan diseases, even though the population, the number of people with these problems is small, the prices are huge. So if anybody remembers spinal muscular atrophy, SMA, one-shot treatment, but that was, when it was introduced, I believe, $2.3 million for that one treatment. You've got cancer drugs that are, when they're introduced, well over $100,000 per year, and a variety of other products for orphan diseases that are similarly very highly priced. And high priced translates into a lot of revenue. And that growth in revenue is just going to increase. It's going to increase quite dramatically. This goes from 2016 to 24. And if you look at figures further into the future, the same kind of elevated increase in sales for these drugs. So this is a real growth market for the pharmaceutical industry, and the pharmaceutical industry is not ignoring it. But what a lot of people do ignore is the fact that the majority of orphan drugs aren't any better than the non-orphan drugs. So this looks at drugs approved in Canada from 2012 to 2021 for oncology indications. So there were 65 orphan drugs approved for 60 orphan drugs approved for oncology indications, 20 non-orphan drugs approved for oncology indications. But if you look at the therapeutic value of those, so major, moderate, little to none, what you see is same distribution. So there may be the occasional orphan drug that really is a lot better, but overall, that's not the case. And if you look at non-oncology indications, you see the same pattern. The distribution of therapeutic benefit, and this is additional therapeutic benefit compared to what's already on the market. If you look at the distribution of therapeutic benefit, there's no difference between the two groups of drugs. So we're putting a lot of money into subsidizing R&D for these diseases. Drug companies are making a lot of money by selling these drugs for these diseases, but patients aren't necessarily doing a lot better when they get these drugs. So R&D expenditure is a function of a number of factors. So population that's affected, length of time that the medication will be used, but there are the bottom 3 are what seems to really count, because as I showed early on, the population that's affected by neglected tropical diseases are in the tens, hundreds of millions. Length of time that medications will be used for some of those diseases are, again, long time periods, but it's the amount of money that's the crucial factor. So what's the gross domestic product of a jurisdiction? How much money do the drug companies hope to be able to charge for the medication? And are the people who are going to be using the medication going to be able to afford it, either through public coverage, private coverage, or in rare cases, if you happen to be a millionaire, out of pocket? And there are policy differences in how these diseases and how R&D for these diseases is being approached. So for neglected diseases, you have a multi-stakeholder approach. And that one prime example of that is the Drugs for Neglected Disease initiative, which was started by Médecins Sans Frontières about 2 decades ago. And DNDi is not a company. It brings together actors in the private, philanthropic, charitable, and public sectors to approach developing new drugs for new diseases. But that means when you've got people from all these different sectors coming together, you have to coordinate priorities. There are a lot of groups that would like to have money to do research into neglected diseases. But so you have to prioritize which diseases you're going to focus on, and that requires compromises. And the funding for R&D in these diseases is what's called push. In other words, you're giving money to organizations to develop the drugs. Rare diseases, on the other hand, the policies tend to be jurisdictionally based, which means that you don't have to try and coordinate between different jurisdictions. And the funding is push in the preclinical stages, so public money, NIH, for instance, but it's pull in the clinical trial stage. In other words, the demand for these products is pulling development of them. And you don't have to worry about where the money is going to be coming from to push development along. So Daniel Vasella, who a couple of decades ago was the CEO of Novartis, one of the big drug companies based in Switzerland, summed up things about the R&D approach for neglected diseases quite nicely. You can't expect for-profit organizations to do this, which is produce new drugs for developing countries on a large scale. If you want to establish a system where companies systematically invest in this kind of area, you need a different system. And he's right, you do. So what could be the different systems? Well, the World Health Organization took a look at this. About a decade ago, they set up an expert working committee with people from around the world to meet and evaluate different proposals for stimulating R&D in developing countries. And they used a bunch of criteria to evaluate the different proposals. So public health impact, efficiency, cost effectiveness. Is it technically feasible? Is it financially feasible? What are the intellectual property considerations? how can we de-link the price of the product from the how much money it takes to do the research and development. A whole series of criteria were used to look at this. And they started with 15 different proposals. And out of those 15, they came up with 6 that they thought merited more, had merit and should be looked at to a greater degree. So, and I'm not going to go through them. The World Health, the report of this expert working group is available online and it can be downloaded easily. But here are just some summaries of the 6 proposals that they thought were worth looking into in more detail. Unfortunately, since this report was published in 2013, really nothing further has happened in terms of developing alternative models. And if you want to, if you want an example of the problems, the ongoing problems, all you have to do is look at the current negotiations that are going on about what's called the Pandemic Accord or Pandemic Treaty. This is the treaty that is supposed to be developed by May of this year, and good luck with that. But after the debacle of the distribution of COVID vaccines around the world, where people in your country and mine had 70 or 80% of people getting at least one vaccine, and the people in most African countries, the figure was 2, 3, 4%. So after we saw this, the idea was that we would develop a legally binding accord around how products should be developed and distributed for the next pandemic, because there is going to be a next pandemic at some point. But if you look at the negotiations, and they're now, I believe, into the 8th round of negotiations, you can see that high-income countries are basically putting multiple conditions on sharing research or knowledge and intellectual property rights that come out of research. They're more or less refusing to put conditions on money that they give to industry to develop products. Industry, of course, is backing the position of the high-income countries, and we have the low and middle-income countries that are trying to push the other way, but so far, at least, without a lot of success. We'll have to see what comes out, but I'm not particularly hopeful. So my bottom line in all of this is that market-based systems, i.e. those based on capitalism, do not lead to therapeutic value when there is little to no money to be made. So I'll stop here and happily take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lexchin. Happy students, if you guys have any questions, we'll go ahead and start with those. Feel free to speak up or type in the chat.
Don't be shy.
We do have one question here from Lydia. I would like to hear Joel's take on whether medications could be perceived as a public utility versus their current status as commodities developed to make money? I guess this is not from a happy student, but we'll go ahead and take it.
Yes. I mean, we see that there's at the extreme, there's a dichotomy in how you can view medications. And this isn't just medications for rare diseases or neglected diseases. This is medications in general. So at one end, these are public health goods. In other words, the same as schools. Not schools aren't public health, but they are a societal good. Garbage collection is a societal good, or you can see them as you can see medications as a way, as a commodity that should be bought and sold in the market. And that's the attitude that the pharmaceutical industry has. And unfortunately, that also seems to be the attitude that a lot of high-income countries take, although the US stands out amongst the high-income countries. You, amongst all the high-income countries, have no method of regulating prices, and you allow direct-to-consumer advertising, which essentially treats these drugs as commodities. The only other country that allows direct-to-consumer advertising is New Zealand. So there have been proposals put out to do much wider reforms of pharmaceutical policy. I was the co-author of one of those, which appeared in the British Medical Journal in May, and we outlined a whole series of measures that we thought could be taken in Canada and the US to completely reform the system to make it much more responsive to public need rather than private profits. If you want to look at it more narrowly, what you can look at are ways of incentivizing private industry to develop products that increase people's health rather than, and make money from doing that rather than selling as many pills or whatever as you can. So that would involve paying drug companies through some kind of a fund for the health value of their products, which would be determined independently of the drug companies. So if something was a major therapeutic advance, so look at the direct-acting antivirals for hepatitis C, major advance, cures 95% or more of people with hepatitis C, major advance. That could be worth a lot of money. On the other hand, the 10th anti-inflammatory on the market, 5 cents a pill. So that's one way of looking at it, but there are many others.
Great, thank you. Any happy students have questions? Yes, Margot.
Hi, thanks for coming to talk to us. I was just wondering, you mentioned the reliance on philanthropic funds to fund neglected diseases and the issues with that. And I was just wondering if you could go into that a little bit more because I thought that was interesting.
Sure. So when we talk about philanthropic organizations, we used to be talking 50 years ago about Rockefeller, but now we're talking about Bill and Melinda Gates primarily. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has an inordinate impact on the direction of R&D into neglected diseases because they give so much money that other people's money just follows theirs. But when you're dealing with philanthropic organizations, there's no accountability. So Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is accountable to the 5 people or so on the board of directors. And if you don't like the direction that it's going in, too bad. And Bill Gates in particular, because of his background, is very strongly in favor of the patent system, does not want to give up, does not think that companies should have to give up intellectual property rights. Patent system means that by and large, you don't get generics on the market for a minimum of about 10 to 11 years after a drug has been put on the market, and in some cases a lot longer. So, and finally, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation takes a very technocratic approach to neglected diseases. So if you look at more broadly at one of the reasons why some of these diseases are spreading, and so look at, for instance, Ebola. Why has Ebola spread? Well, it's because the natural habitat for the reservoir, and I think the reservoir are bats, but if I'm wrong, somebody should correct me, but whatever the animal reservoir is, has been expanding because of what's being done to the environment where those animals are living. So they're being forced out of their natural habitat and into new habitats where they're more likely to come in contact with people and spread the disease. But Bill and Melinda Gates, by and large, their money doesn't look at things like that. They're focused much more on a commodity, on a product, a vaccine, a pill, what have you. If you want to read about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, there's an excellent book, and I think it's called There's No Such Thing as a Free Lunch, and the author is Lindsay, Linsey, McGoey, McGoey.
Great, thank you. Any other happy students have questions? I can jump in. I have one question for you, Dr. Lecton. I know you mentioned pandemic preparedness. How can we improve preparedness for the next pandemic, and how does this advocacy or work itself align with recognition and advocacy of rare diseases?
So as you can see, rare diseases or pandemics are not either rare or neglected. But pandemic preparedness primarily relies on strong public health systems. That's the first line of defense. So what that means is funding public health systems much better than we do. I think in the US, the figure is 1% of the spending on healthcare goes to public health measures. So we need to increase that significantly so that a number of things can be done. So first of all, you need a good surveillance system. So Canada had that up until just before the pandemic, at which point we abandoned it. This was something that was looking at around the world at all sorts of sources of information, newspaper reports, what was on the chatter on Twitter or X as it now is, just looking at all different sources, not just scientific ones, to see were people talking about something new that was going on in terms of diseases. Pandemics are going to be infectious diseases, so that's what you want to focus on. You want to, as I said, you want to try and minimize the encroachment of animal reservoirs into contact with humans. You want to be able to quickly identify these things. So that means getting genetic sequencing of new diseases, viruses out quickly and shared, not kept as proprietary information. You want to fund the R&D for any therapies, be those pills for people who get sick or vaccines to stop people from getting sick. That funding should come with conditions attached to it. So it should say, you have to be transparent around any contracts that you sign with countries. There can't be any hidden clauses. You have to price the products at levels that are affordable in different countries with different levels of economic ability. You have to distribute the products appropriately. You can't distribute 80% of your products to the 20% of people who live in high income countries. You have to distribute them equally, a whole bunch of things like that. And there are more. Some of the clauses in the current version of the pandemic accord, which is available online, go into the areas that people think are going to be necessary to deal with the next pandemic. Some of the clauses are quite weak, but the ideas that they're putting forward, in other words, the areas that need to be covered, are reasonably comprehensive.
Thank you. Okay, any other happy students have questions? I know we have a few non-happy student questions in the chat, so we can jump to those once we confirm no more questions from happy students. Okay, well, in that case, we'll jump to Michael Oldani. Left 2 comments. Part 1, can you comment on Vyndamax by Pfizer for the wild type and hereditary forms of transthyretin amyloid cardiomyopathy, a rare and serious condition? It is $250K per year in the US with a $20K copay covered by a Pfizer charity. They push this drug on seniors to extend life by several years, often at a huge cost, covering the copay.
Well, I think that, again, the prices that you're seeing for this particular drug, which I'm not particularly familiar with, those prices are a reflection of the inability of the US to control drug prices. You don't allow Medicare to negotiate with the companies. You don't have any, you don't use reference-based pricing, whereby you look at what other countries are charging for the same drug. You don't put you don't look at on a government level, you don't look at how much value people are going to get from a particular drug. You just let the companies charge whatever they want. If the companies happen to be generous and cover your copay, that's fine. But the copay coverage, if your price is high enough, the copay is going to be out of bounds of any individual person. So this particular drug and many others like it are just a reflection of the problems you see in the US. But though the similar problems, although not on quite as large a scale, are also seen in Canada, the European Union countries, the UK, Australia. And when you get beyond those countries, who cares? Because nobody's going to be able to afford those products.
Mm. And then the second part to that question as well is or more of a probe to comment is that pharma now deploys thousands of med liaison specialists and med outcome specialists to help grow markets for drugs like Vindamax. For example, justifying costs. And can you comment on that as well?
Well, I mean, one of the strategies that the large drug companies have developed is not, they don't just make drugs. Actually, they don't make drugs either. What they do is they buy promising products that startups have developed. So small, medium-sized companies just get bought. If they have a drug that looks good, they buy it up. The big companies buy it up, finish the clinical trials, and put it on the market. But that creates a bidding war for these small and medium-sized companies. So with the first direct acting antiviral, this is Sovaldi, Gilead paid $11 billion to buy the company that had developed the early version of that drug. And where did that $11 billion go? Well, it went into the price that Gilead was going to charge. But the other thing about the big drug companies is that they have also now control knowledge. So from even before, Adrian can talk about this because she got recruited to write an article about the problems with the previous version of the anticoagulants. This is warfarin or Coumadin. And she got recruited to write something about the interaction between Coumadin and herbs because the company was laying the groundwork for the new anticoagulants, what are the NOACs, novel oral anticoagulants, that they were going to be introducing. So even before they had a drug, they laid the framework. There's something wrong with the existing products. They plan the clinical trials around the market that they hope to sell the drug in. So where do we think we're going to get the greatest level of sales? And so let's target our clinical trials so that we have results that will allow us to market in those areas. They write up the results of the clinical trials that are going to be published. They hire medical writers to do that. They pay physicians to go around the country speaking about the drugs. The clinical practice guidelines have people writing them who have significant conflicts of interest with the drug companies. So drug companies are trying to control, and very successfully, I might say, control the information market around the products that they make. And what Michael is asking about is just one example of how they do that.
Great, thank you. Donald left a comment. Thank you, Joel, for a concise overview with a strong moral message. Could you please comment on DNDi as a multinational initiative for designing, funding, and doing focused research on selected and neglected diseases? What do you think of the rules and organization for greatly limiting patent protections and setting up affordable pricing that lower income countries can afford?
Well, DNDi's model has been to develop good products for neglected diseases. And they've done a reasonable job around that. So they've developed, I believe, or brought to market about a dozen, maybe more drugs Some of those have been reformulations of existing products, but they've also brought, I believe, about 5 new chemical entities or new molecular entities to market. In other words, drugs that have never been marketed before in any form. I think that the overall R&D costs for DNDi are in the range of $100 million for a new drug to come to market. So significantly lower if you believe the figures that Pharma puts out of $2.6 billion. But DNDi is limited. DNDi has limited resources. It does a good job as far as it goes, but it's not going to, and it could be a model for other versions of nonprofit drug discovery and development, but on its own, it's not going to solve the problems that I was describing.
Great, thank you. Sharon had one question. Can you comment on the impact of patient advocacy groups on policies for rare and neglected diseases? Do you think patient advocates could have a positive impact? They also had a similar question to this.
So the patient groups around the world, at least as far as I know, and I'm talking again about high-income countries, so Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, some parts of the European Union, are by and large underfunded or get no independent sources of funding. So where do they go for the money? Well, the natural place to go is to the companies that are making products in the area that these patient groups are focused on. And drug companies, as long as the patient groups are giving the right message, and that's a message that's congruent with what the message that's coming from the drug companies are quite willing to fund these patient groups. And when you look at the positions that patient groups take, and there's been a little bit of research into this, there are about 4 or 5 studies that have examined positions that patient groups have taken, and are they in favor of public health interests? Are they in favor of the interests of drug companies? And one example was, should there be direct-to-consumer advertising in the European Union? And the patient groups that were in favor of that were getting money, the ones getting money from drug companies, and the patient groups that were against that were the ones that weren't getting money from drug companies. In Canada, I've looked at what did patient groups say when a Canadian body is looking at whether or not to recommend public funding for drugs. And when patient groups get money from drug companies, it's almost 100% of the time that their submissions are in favor of public funding. So patient groups could be a strong force for pushing R&D and prices in a way that benefits public health. But until we remove that conflict of interest that they have, that's a problem. If you look at, do patient groups have policies for how they deal with their interactions with drug companies? By and large, patient groups don't. And if they do, those policies are weak.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, one more question from John Grogan. How can the court of public opinion affect positive change, or is the present situation our destiny? Is there hope for the future?
So, it may look pretty glum at this point, but I draw on what happened in the Canadian province of Saskatchewan back in the 1940s. So Saskatchewan is a rural province. Most of the people at that point were living in the countryside. It depended on agriculture. Lots of homes had no electricity or running water. They elected a social democratic government, in other words, a left-wing government. And not just because of the philosophy of the government, but because of the philosophy or the actions of the people who were supporting that government, so trade unions, teachers, a lot of the farmers, they pushed through the first universal public coverage system for hospital care in North America. And about 15 years later, they pushed through the first universal system for physician coverage, public physician coverage in North America. So the premier at that time was a guy named Tommy Douglas. And one of the things he said was something like, "Don't despair, it's never too late to hope and change." And that's my philosophy, that things can always change, but you have to be people and not have to be pushing for it and not rely on something from the top down.
Great. Thank you so much. Is there any other comments or questions?
Okay, barring any additional questions, Joel, I really want to thank you deeply for being willing to deliver this seminar with not too much notice, and for delivering a really relevant and important seminar for this group. So thanks again, and I thank everyone for attending and being part of this today. Hallie, you did a great job moderating, and we have more great seminar coming up, so please tune in. You'll be getting an announcement about next week's seminar in your email within probably 24 to 48 hours. So Hallie, back to you.
Thank you all. That is all. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Joel.
Take care.
Thank you,
I feel
Joel.
better.
See you all next week.